So, hello, and welcome to Truth You Can Wake Up To. I'm Samuel William on the 7th of January 2012. So, I want to start this episode by saying one simple thing. You are not a person. Now, hopefully I'm preaching to the converted here, but myself, I only came across this idea about a year ago, and it really transformed the way I felt about myself and the way I felt about freedom and servitude and the government and how I interact with all of those things. I'm sure a lot of you out there, just like I am, not particularly happy with the government of this country or the government of any country, really, in the way that they operate, especially in Western countries. We are basically being robbed every day of our lives through inflation and the charging of interest on loans and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of people feel powerless in this situation and think, well, what on earth can we do about it? Which is where freedom comes in. Now, I say you're not a person because the word person is actually a very specific thing in the way that it is used in our world. It's a legal word. Now, in a law dictionary, the word person means a fictional entity used for legal purposes. Now, that sounds pretty confusing, but essentially, you do have a person, but you are not a person. In fact, your person, your fictional legal entity, was created when you were born. It's called your birth certificate. And on your birth certificate, it says what you think is your name, but it's actually just the same letters as the name that you were given by your parents. And of course, crucially, and a lot of people might have come across this sort of thing, it's written in capital letters. Now, I sort of heard about this thing about capital letters, your name written in capital letters isn't you, and all of that kind of stuff years and years ago when I was sort of in my late teens. But I paid no attention, really. It was interesting, but just sort of passed by me. Didn't really sound like reality to me. It was only a lot later on, and I'm talking, 10, 12 years later, where I came across it again, and it started to make sense. Now, of course, this is all about freedom, because without this fictional entity called your birth certificate and the piece of paper that you represent, you can't really function within a country. You cannot get a bank account, you cannot get a loan, you can't really do anything. You can't enter into contracts properly with any corporations or businesses. You can't leave the country, for example. You can't get a passport without this legal fictional entity called your birth certificate. So it's a very important thing for most people, which is why your parents sign it. And we call it a birth certificate. And if somebody says, I'll need to see your birth certificate, you show them your birth certificate, except that isn't your birth certificate. That's the copy of your birth certificate. And I think everybody is kind of subliminally aware that actually that's the copy of their birth certificate and not the real one. Well, where is the real one? Well, it's held by the people that own it. Now, you could say, these people, they own my person. Does that mean they own me? Now, of course, dealing in the land of words, which is the legal world, or the law society, as it is actually known, registration has a very specific meaning. It comes from regis, as in the crown. Now, if you'd listened to a few of my episodes, you might have come across when I was talking about the crown, which doesn't actually mean the Queen at all. It sounds like it does, but it's actually the City of London is the crown. The government there is the crown. Very confusing, but then that's the way they like it. And it is, in fact, just on the way into the City of London down Fleet Street. As you're going down towards St Paul's Cathedral, on the right-hand side of the road, you have Temple Bar, where you have the inner and middle Temple of Law. And that area of Temple features in the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, and of course the film, where they go to the Temple Church, because the area of Temple used to belong to the Knights Templar, and they controlled the finances of the country, basically, on behalf of the Vatican in Rome, and their power was eventually wrestled from them, basically during and around the time of Henry VIII, and they were banished, were the Knights Templar, and they actually went up to Scotland, where they founded the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and they had their symbol of the double-headed eagle, and you can still see the double-headed eagle on various things down Fleet Street and on the side of Temple Bar. Now, the double-headed eagle has a very specific meaning. It looks both ways, to the old world and the new world. And, of course, most people would have heard of the idea of a new world order. Well, that's essentially what it's talking about, is controlling the old world order and the new world order, and therefore controlling the entire planet. That was the aim, that was the goal of Rome, and that's why the Knights Templar were there. Well, of course, the control system is still there in Temple Bar, but it's now a legal control system. Of course, the Knights Templar were attempting to control the masses through the Roman Catholic Church. It was the religion that controlled the masses, and then that stopped working, mainly because of Henry VIII. He wanted a divorce. He couldn't get one from the monks down at Blackfriars, so he dissolved the monasteries, basically abolished the Roman Catholic Church in England and founded the Church of England instead, and along with that went the control of the Roman Catholic Church upon the common people. And so instead, a new system of control needed to be developed, and that's the law system. So when you have a registration of birth, a registration, you are giving ownership of a new entity to the Crown. And this is also true for your possessions, things like your car, for example. If you've got a car, you'll have a registration document, a registration document, whereby you've actually signed over ownership to the Crown, and now you are the registered keeper. Not the owner, just the keeper. And you can see the logic of this plays out, because you now have to abide by the legislation of the road. For example, in this country, if you don't insure your car, it can be taken away from you and crushed. And actually they like doing it to show people that they need to behave. Now, if that was actually your car, your possession, then taking it away from you would be theft and criminal damage by crushing it. But of course it's not, is it? Because you don't actually own it. It belongs to the Crown. Now, I came across a book by Veronica Chapman, and it's called Freedom is More Than a 7-Letter Word. And that really is a must-read. It's written quite humorously. It's written with a lot of strength, and it really sets out the main difference between what is law and what is legal. And believe it or not, Veronica Chapman really sets this out beautifully as she explains that the word lawful and the word legal are actually opposites. And this stems from the idea that we are in a common law country. England, the United Kingdom, is a common law country. The United States, most European nations, and a lot of countries around the world are common law nations. Now, common law applies to the land. It's the law of the land. not to be confused with the law of the sea, which is actually British Admiralty law. It's the way that Britain created the British Empire by applying the law of the sea upon the land. It's also what we call corporate law. So a corporation cannot operate on the land in and of itself. It has to abide by common law. And that's because a corporation is a fictional entity. It is in fact a person is a corporation. It exists on paper and it needs human beings to interact with it in order for it to function. Now, common law has really been around since the Magna Carta in 1215, and it's a very, very simple thing which says you cannot kill someone, you cannot harm someone, and you cannot steal anything. And you also cannot allow any of those things to happen through your own negligence. So it's a very, very simple thing. And actually, it encompasses just about every single human interaction. And the reason it's law is because it's very similar to a law of the universe, like the law of gravity. It's something which exists and we document it. Now, it was the Magna Carta 1215 that really was the documentation of an observation that we shouldn't kill people, we shouldn't steal things, and we shouldn't rob people or con people, and we shouldn't allow those things to happen through negligence. Now, any other law, as we call it, above that is not actually a law, it's a statute. And a statute has the force of law upon consent by the governed. Now, there's that word consent, which is very, very important. We need to consent to statutes, the rules of the law society, which is basically our government. That's where it came from. If we do not consent, then they do not apply to us. And that is talking about anything that is not common law. Now, the reason that law and legal are opposites is because the common law was documenting something that was observed. Legal things or statutes are not observed in the first place, but are made up by man and then written down, which is why they do not apply to people unless you agree to go along with it. So, my apologies, I realise this is getting a little bit heavy, and that is why at this juncture we're going to have a little break. But just before we do, for anybody who is not listening from the United Kingdom, a civil enforcement officer is actually a traffic warden.
I'm a civil enforcement. Right, John. John. Alright, how's it going, mate? Alright. I'm civil enforcement. I'm civil enforcement. Oh, yes. What is this? Here we go. Nissan Micra. Yeah, there it is. Single yellow line. Check the time. 5:31. Yes! Let the ticket writing commence. So, I've got my piece of paper. I got my pen.
Excuse me, what are you doing?
What?
This is my car. Do you have any business here?
Business?
Yes, what is your business?
I'm the civil enforcement, sir.
Right.
Is it your car?
Yeah, this is my car.
Well, I'm afraid you are on a single yellow line, sir.
Yes.
It is precisely 5:32.
But it's actually...
Therefore, I'm writing you a ticket.
You can't do that.
Well, I'm afraid I can, sir. I've got my paper. I've got my pen.
Look,
I'm writing this.
Look, you can do whatever you like with your piece of paper.
Yes.
The fact remains, parking tickets have no foundation in law.
Law?
Yes, you may have heard of it. Law?
It's not based upon law.
No, it's an act of parliament, my boy.
Oh.
I have to agree for you to write me a ticket.
You have to agree.
And guess what? I don't agree.
Oh,
Yes,
all right then. Sorry about that.
that's all right.
And
Yes.
have a nice day, I suppose.
Well, thank you.
Oh, I'm civil enforcement. I'm a civil
Civil
enforcement.
enforcement,
indeed.
John.
All right, mate.
John, all right. Oh, that's tasty. Come on now.
So, parking violations, council tax, income tax, just about anything you can think of that isn't common law is just a rule or a regulation set up by the Law Society, and they have the force of law if you consent to it. And you have to consent, because a piece of paper, a fictional entity like a corporation, cannot dictate to a human being. In actual fact, in a lawful court, in a normal court scenario, which, by the way, we don't actually have anymore, but in a lawful court, a corporation cannot win a case over a human. A human will always win. And the way that it's become that a corporation, let's say, for example, your local council, which is a corporation, your local council can win against you in a court if you are not representing a human being, you're actually representing your birth certificate. So the case is actually between a legal fiction, a piece of paper, your birth certificate, against a legal fiction, a piece of paper, the corporation, in which case they have equal standing and either of them can win, and it's up to the court to decide. But if you instead go into a court and represent you and do not represent that piece of paper, then the corporation cannot win. But the one thing I want to mention before I finish this point is that our courts are not lawful anymore. In fact, believe it or not, human beings are not welcome in that court. It is a court for pieces of paper. So you will find, if you are given a summons, which actually means invitation in a law dictionary, and you choose to represent your human being, the case cannot proceed, and they get very confused, very upset, very angry, because they realise that no one's going to get paid that day. Now, I mentioned that your local council is a corporation, and it may sound like a strange thing. And all corporations have to be registered, and you can actually look up any corporation you like on the Companies House website. And you will find that your local council is a corporation, your local court is a corporation, your police force is a corporation. In fact, it goes all the way back to your country is a corporation. The United Kingdom Corporation, the Corporation of the United States of America, the Corporation of Canada, you name it, France, Germany, Sweden, whatever, it's a corporation. And of course, most recently, Libya is now a corporation. Of course, Iraq is a corporation, and nestling right in the middle there is an independent republic called Iran, which could be the largest corporation in the region if certain people behind the scenes have their way in this coming year. But they all operate upon the same system, which is the legal system, which is the law of the sea and not the law of the land. Now, our police do operate not under the law, but under legislation. And one of the most common things to prove this is when a police officer asks you, do you understand? This is one of the fundamental things you'll hear a lot. Do you understand? Which actually means, do you stand under? Now, this is where it goes down the rabbit hole, and this is where a lot of people sort of lose the ability to follow this line of thinking. Because when a police officer asks you, do you understand, he thinks he's asking you if you comprehend. Most people will think when you're asked that he's saying, do you comprehend? But he's not. It's a legal process where he's saying, do you understand, meaning do you stand under? He's saying, can I now have authority over you and then proceed in a procedure against you? Can I enforce a statute upon your person, is what he is saying. And most people will say, yes, that's fine. But of course, if you're interested in freedom, the answer is no, I do not stand under you. And then the policeman will get very confused, and he'll call his superior, who won't get confused because he knows the system, and you'll be left alone. Through a Freedom of Information request, it actually turns out that Devon and Cornwall Police is owned by a subsidiary company of IBM. So believe it or not, IBM owns a company, and that company owns the police force in Devon and Cornwall, which is quite a huge area. And they run it for profit, of course. It's a good moneymaker, because crime does pay. Now, the police are a very interesting thing, and they're essentially, the idea of the police was written down in Magna Carta. There were peace officers, constables, and all this kind of stuff, which were representatives of the people. Of course, we can see that that's not true anymore. But essentially, a police officer can hold a gun. And the police can have guns. Why? Because the people can have guns. Because they are a representation of the people. So if the people weren't allowed guns, then the police wouldn't be allowed guns. But, of course, we've all been told that we can have a gun if you have a license. Now, licenses are really, really interesting, and actually if you research about this whole thing of lawful rebellion, as it's called, and the idea of being a freeman on the land, which is a very, very good idea. In actual fact, we are all born free, and we choose to go into servitude because of things like licenses. Now, there are people out there that actually drive around in a car without a license. Crazy, you might say. Crazy. They also drive without insurance. Crazy. They must be crazy, these people. No. They're not crazy. You need insurance because that company needs profit. And you just say, well, if you crashed into someone, then it's such an extraordinary amount of money, how would you ever pay? So you're telling me you don't pay your insurance company more money in the long run than you would do to pay for any accidents you might have, especially if you are a careful driver. Does it not, in fact, breed uncareful drivers, the fact that we have insurance? So if we didn't have insurance, would people drive more carefully? I think, yes, they would. They'd also know that if you did crash with someone, and it's between two parties, you could take it to a lawful court, and one person would have to pay for the damages, both physical and emotional. And then that's how it works. And it's between two people without a profit-making company being involved. Seems to make more sense. Now, the idea of a license is a curious one. And when you sort of think about it, it's so logical, so obvious, that it's amazing that we've been fooled for so long. Now, you can get a license to drive because driving is lawful. Now, the government, or the DVLA as we have it in this country, the DMV in America, surely they couldn't grant a license for something that is unlawful. They can't give a license for criminal activities. They grant licenses for things that are lawful. Yes, We can understand that's logical. Well, if it's a lawful activity, why on earth do you need a licence for it? You should be able to drive without a licence if it's lawful, surely. But then, of course, the rebuttal to arguments like that are, you can't have people driving around without licences because, they need to learn how to drive. Yes, they do need to learn how to drive. It's called being a responsible human being. Yes, you should learn how to drive. Yes, you should try and avoid getting into accidents. Yes, you should sort of limit your speed if you're in a crowded area. Yes, absolutely. But these are the things that we should be taking upon ourselves to realise and do without any organisation or corporation or government informing us that we have to abide by it. It should be natural and within us, and in actual fact, the natural innate ability to look after ourselves and one another is actually taken away when we have all this legislation and corporations getting involved. They're not involved because they care about us. In actual fact, car crashes and people getting run over and stuff like that are actually profitable for some corporations. And that's something we need to be very worried about. Definitely starting to preach now. Apologies. It's just very, very simple stuff. So, before this episode goes over half an hour, I want to sort of round it off just by talking about one thing that is probably affecting most people on the planet, and that is, of course, debt. The borrowing of money, the not being able to pay it back, the interest charged, and all of that kind of stuff. Well, we talked at the very beginning about the birth certificate. It's actually the birth certificate which is used as a security so that our governments can borrow money from international banks. And when I say international banks, I mean central banks. The Bank of England is essentially an international bank. It has owners and they are held offshore. The profits don't go back to the people. It's not a public asset. It is a private asset. And it's conjoined with the European Central Bank and the Bank of International Settlements and the International Monetary Fund, all of this kind of stuff. They're international money lenders. They lend money to governments. Now, they don't just lend it. They have to be given some security. Now, the security that they are given is in the form of bonds, which come from the country, which is essentially displaying the asset of the country, which is the working people. And you identify the working people by their birth certificates. So this just begs one question. If you've borrowed money to buy a house and you can't pay it back, the house ends up belonging to the person you borrowed it off. Now, if the government is borrowing money from these people and the government can't pay it back, what asset gets given to the moneylender? That is an important question. And if that asset then belongs to that international moneylender which isn't based within that country, and that moneylender also owns the acquired assets of other countries, would it not choose to amalgamate all of those assets into one, creating one big country, the world? Would we not then become citizens or slaves of a world corporate entity? And I'm going to leave you with that. So I've been Samuel William. This has been Truth You Can Wake Up To. Goodbye.